Just to recap a little bit, yesterday we were able to hear sort of where the science is and isn't on studying workplace mental health. We heard from a psychologist on how he applies these theories in practice as a CEO, and also what he teaches to others organizationally. And today we're going to see it through yet another framework, and that is one of psychological capital. So here to introduce us to that is Dr. Dennis Stolle. Dr. Stolle is the Senior Director of Applied Psychology at the American Psychological Association. So that is exactly what it sounds like, applied psychology. He's thinking all the time and working all the time, in terms of how things can actually be applied to make people's lives and emotional and psychological health better in the real world. He is also a licensed attorney, so if you have legal questions, there's an option there. And he has been extensively quoted because of his fantastic expertise in the Washington Post, Fortune, ABC News, all over. So I'm sure that you all will be able to think of ways that you can use him for your own stories. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dennis Stolle.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and congratulations to all of you for being here as well. And thank you for your interest in this topic. At the American Psychological Association, one of our overarching goals is to increase psychological well-being and top psychological performance for the entire population. And so then you need to think about, all right, so how do we get out to the entire population? And psychologically healthy workplaces is one of the ways to do that, because most people at some point in their life work. And so if you can reach workplaces, then you can reach very large numbers of people. And it's not just the numbers of people who you can reach through the workplace, but it's also the depth of what you can do through workplace scenarios. And so these are numbers that you've all seen before, but the average person, if they work full time their entire life, they spend something like 80 to 90,000 hours at work. So that's a huge chunk of your life. That's like 24/7 for a decade. That has a major impact on who you are over the course of your lifetime. So we really want to be able to influence that at the APA. And before I go into the substantive topic of psychological capital, I want to kind of pause to take note of some definitions I just think are so critical to reflect on as we talk about these topics. When we talk about psychologically healthy workplaces, the conversation often drifts to mental health. That's the word. You go to Google, you type in mental health. That's how you're going to find the stuff that you're looking for. And mental health, that word just sort of exploded around the time of the pandemic. Everybody's saying the word mental health. And you can read an article about mental health and it's about suicide, something that's serious. You can read an article about mental health and it's about Zoom fatigue. And you start to think, well, what are we even talking about anymore? Where are the parameters on what mental health even means? And so I think it's important to just kind of define that from my perspective at the outset so that you understand where I'm coming from on the topic. The definition that I really like of mental health is the one that's put forth by the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well, work well, contribute to their community. It is more than the absence of mental illness. It exists on a complex continuum. And so when you have that definition in mind, you may come at the topic differently than if you're thinking about mental health as merely a euphemism for mental illness. This is a much more expansive definition than merely mental illness. Now, that continuum that the World Health Organization references, this is the way I would draw that continuum. And there are other people who draw it other ways, but everybody basically, it looks something like this, where at one side you've got severe mental illness, at the other side you've got absolute top psychological performance, psychological flourishing, sort of the ultimate level of happiness and fulfillment. Generally speaking, and I'm speaking in generalities and tendencies, not black and white, psychologists tend to fall into two different types. There are the psychologists who do therapy and are clinicians, they are healthcare service providers, and there are psychologists who don't do that. And they are scientists and they work with organizations and industry and so forth. And so the therapists tend to be at this end of the continuum, dealing with severe mental illness all the way to trying to get people out of that illness state into a state of flourishing. The rest of the psychologists tend to work at that end of the continuum, where they're not treating patients who have a problem. Instead, they're working with how are people interacting in groups in ways that are going to promote everyone's psychological well-being and everyone's performance and so on. I'm a social and personality psychologist, not a clinical psychologist, so I tend to be over here on this end of the continuum. I say all that because it gives you a sense then of where I'm coming from when I talk about these issues and why I might sound different than someone who's treating patients in a therapy room. And this continuum also, it gets baked into the two dominant approaches for workplace well-being. And those two dominant approaches are a focus on the individual versus a focus on the organization. And I think that as reporters, when you're out there looking at these issues, this is a distinction that you'll see, and you'll be able to immediately realize with anyone you're talking to, are they talking about the individual approach or are they talking about the organizational approach? And this distinction has recently played itself out in the media. I work with a group of volunteers who are APA members who are focused on workplace well-being interventions. I meet with them monthly. There's about 20 of us. They're the leading experts in the entire country. January of this year, I woke up to a bunch of emails. Did you read the news this morning? Okay, I'll read the news. You know, what's going on? So here's the headline. Workplace wellness programs have little benefit, study finds. And I blocked out the reporter and the publication and said, I'm not claiming that anybody did anything wrong with this. But you read that headline and you're a person who has dedicated your life to workplace wellness interventions, and you see that in probably the leading newspaper in the country, and you know that CEOs read headlines, not articles. Yikes. So then, well, all right, I got to keep reading. Start actually reading the article, and it looks bad initially. But then you kind of look at it and it's like, well, this is talking about massage classes and sleep apps. I'm not sure that's the same thing that my colleagues are doing. And so then the next step is, well, I better go look at this article that this reporter is writing about. You go and look at the article, and bam, there it is. The article is about individual level interventions, not organizational level interventions. And so a big difference there is that many organizations are attracted to the individual level interventions because that means they don't have to do anything. Here, I'll pay $15 a month for you to have an app, and you go fix yourself. And I'll check that box and get back to whatever my other work was. I don't have to change anything about the corporate culture. I don't have to address the reasons that made you sleepless at night or any of those things. And, you know, it'll go on my ESG report and we're all good. So that's what this researcher was talking about is not working. And the article itself didn't get it wrong. It's just deep in the article. And so they talked to Dr. Fleming, the author of the article, and he explains that he's not talking about the overall approach of workplace well-being. He's talking about these very specific individual interventions. And they talked to another researcher who is specific and says, that's the baby you shouldn't be throwing out with the bathwater. So the article says all this. It's not that the article is wrong, but the fear among all my friends is we know that nobody reads articles anymore. They just scroll through headlines, and that looked really bad. And it didn't end there. So others then started picking up this headline, doing webinars. The workplace wellness program is dead. Now what? Now, if you're the interested reader and you go down into the fine print, you see that they're actually not saying what the headline said, but maybe it seems snappy. They're going to draw people in to come to their webinar. Again, for the busy CEO who's scrolling through what webinars can I attend? Oh, I don't have to attend that one. I already saw on a big newspaper that's dead. This says it's dead. We don't do that anymore. No need to spend money on that. All of this then brings me to the concept of psychological capital. And I'm curious how many of you have heard the term psychological capital before today? Okay, I don't see any hands up, and that's good because I was hoping to introduce you to a new concept that you have not already heard of, but one that I think you may be hearing more about in the future because it is emerging. The idea of psychological capital is, we've all heard of financial capital and human capital and social capital and so on. And a business has to have financial capital in order to be able to operate. Everybody knows that because, you lose a contract or something, you got to have a reserve of money to be able to dip into to pay the employees for the week where you don't have the income coming in. So that's financial capital. You've got to have it. The analogy between financial capital or other kinds of capital and psychological capital is the concept that people, not just people, but groups of people. So this is something where we're talking now both about the individual level and the organizational level, can actually build up a reserve of psychological well-being that they can draw upon like an account when times get tough and they need to have it. And so that concept is really appealing, right? Because we all know that there are some times where you're just not going to be able to do the things you'd like to be able to do to keep yourself healthy. If you had a bank where you could just make a withdrawal, that would be fantastic. And that's what researchers have been looking at with psychological capital and trying to get at what would be the elements of this bank account? What kinds of things would go into that account? And this has been heavily influenced by concepts of positive psychology. And so that again means we're kind of moving along that continuum away from severe mental illness and more into the range of optimal psychological functioning. And so the research that is being done has pointed to 4 components to psychological capital. The first component is the concept of hope. And I usually spell psychological with the L at the end of psychological. But this is a very scientific way of doing it that you may not be familiar with. The concept of hope is a tricky one, and all the pieces that go in are tricky in this way, in that hope is a word that we all use all the time in our common vernacular, and we think we know what it means. But then it is assigned a very specific meaning as a term of art in the literature that might be a little different than the way we use the word. And so then that can lead to confusion. You're talking to a scientist about hope, and they're saying things that, well, that doesn't quite make sense, and you try to generalize the way you think of the word hope, and it gets all messed up. It would be almost better if psychologists were more like medical doctors and use these words that nobody can pronounce and nobody uses, because that forces you to understand what that specific word means rather than reusing a word that we all already use anyway. But unfortunately, we're stuck with the fact that that's what we do. And so hope is there. And in this context, hope means the concept that there is a identifiable path forward. It doesn't mean that it is going to be an easy path forward. It just means that there is some potential, plausible, imaginable way out of this situation. When you're stuck in a cage and it's locked and there's no way to get out, that's hopelessness. When you're in a situation where it may be really tough, but there's some way to figure this out, that's hope. That's a glimmer of hope. And so hope has to be part of the equation of psychological capital. The next one is efficacy. And in the literature, it's often referred to as self-efficacy. But efficacy is or self-efficacy is the sense that you or your team, your organization is efficacious. You can do stuff. You've done stuff before, you can do stuff again. And when you combine that with hope, hope being identification of some path forward, self-efficacy is the idea that, wow, that sounds almost impossible, but we are pretty effective, and so we might be able to follow that path forward. It's not just that the path exists, but we can't do it. It's the idea that the path exists and we might be able to do it. So hope and efficacy. The third concept going into it is resilience. And resilience is essentially, and this is a term that's borrowed from lots of other areas of psychology, and so you're probably familiar with this concept, but it is the sense of the ability to return to baseline. So everybody, operates at some level, then something happens to you, you experience psychological distress, your psychological well-being goes down. Resilience is the ability to come back up to baseline in some reasonable amount of time. Or better yet, to come back above baseline because you have learned from the experience and you have been strengthened by the experience. So now we're up to hope, efficacy, and resilience. The final and fourth component being, wait for it. The final one is optimism, and this is the one that maybe leads to the most confusion because optimism has really gotten a bad name. There's even people walking around talking about toxic positivity and so on and so forth, which is probably a real thing. Too much of anything is bad, right? Even Brussels sprouts. So we're not talking here about irrational belief that I'm going to be fine no matter what, all that. What we're talking about with the concept of optimism, especially when it's baked into all of these other concepts, is the idea that there is a potential path forward. I might be able to follow it. And it's going to be tough, maybe, and maybe it's not going to work out. But in the end, I'll be all right. We're all going to be okay. So it's just that sense of we can move forward. We don't have to be paralyzed by fear that somehow the world is crashing down around us. Now, the research has begun to look at these four components, both at an individual level, so it can be measured using a validated scale that is still being debated in the literature, but it's a scale that's getting a lot of attention because it's being debated in the literature, called the PsyCap scale. And so it's a questionnaire you can fill out. It's like 40 questions depending on the version you use, and it measures where you are in terms of your existing psychological capital. And then that can also be measured at an organizational level. So how are teams doing in terms of their psychological capital? How is an entire organization doing in terms of their psychological capital? And then researchers are looking at how does that correlate with the trajectory of organizational success, and finding that in organizations lacking or teams lacking psychological capital, that first roadblock that comes up, maybe it's the big contract that got lost, maybe it's the lawsuit that was filed, maybe it's the economic downturn, everybody runs for the door. They start looking for a new job. In organizations that have psychological capital, everybody looks at it and says, yeah, these things happen. We're going to get through it. Let's get to work. Let's figure this out. That can be the difference between success and failure. So that makes psychological capital a pretty important concept. And one of the funny and nice things about it is that maybe some of you have already noticed that hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism spells hero. So it's real easy to remember. And you can talk to people about becoming a hero at work, and they remember that. It makes sense to them. They know what the acronym means. And psychological capital, I find often just that term gets you out of a conversation that may still carry certain stigma or discomfort. And so you're talking about doing even better rather than getting over something that's wrong with you. And so when I go to rooms and talk about this concept, often eyes light up and they're delighted. They're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're talking about this and not what I thought you were here to talk about. So another really, really interesting aspect of psychological capital is the sense of contagion. The idea that psychological capital can, number one, be developed like a muscle through exercise. But beyond that, even better than exercise, I wish exercise were contagious, but psychological capital can be contagious. And so researchers have been looking at, this is an article that includes Fred Luthans, who I mentioned that name in particular because he's really considered the founder of the concept of psychological capital and the leading researcher. Researchers have been looking at what happens when you have a leader in a team who is high on psychological capital. What happens to the team members? And in this article, they're looking specifically at global organizations. And so thinking about, could this be contagious even across offices, across a large organization, and finding evidence that it is. And I think that's particularly important with the way the future of work is developing and remote work and hybrid work and global work becoming more and more an aspect of what we're all doing. And so if this does not require the face-to-face all day long interpersonal interaction, but can be contagious at more of an organizational cultural level, that is a fantastic thing. There are also articles that have looked at where they do experiments and they will have team leaders go through training to develop their psychological capital, and they fill out surveys to see if their psychological capital is increasing. They don't tell the direct reports to the team leaders that the team leaders are going through this. Direct reports have no idea that this is happening. But they're also measuring the psychological capital of the direct reports. And as the team leader's psychological capital goes up, the direct reports' psychological capital goes up. So what a wonderful thing, right? To be able to develop something in yourself that helps you, and it just sort of magically starts to help the people around you as well, and everybody starts to do better. Now, like any theory that's emerging in the psychological science, there's still debate. There's debate about, well, are the 4 factors that I listed, are those really the 4? Does one of them contribute more than another one? There's debate about if you have all 4 together, does that amount to more than merely the sum of the parts? And these are things I don't think we fully understand yet, and it's part of the direction that the research is going. But to me, this is an interesting concept and one that I'm seeing out there and that I hope we may begin to see more of. We have on the APA webpage a very short article that provides you with citations to the science that backs up all the things that I just said. And I've put a QR code up here for you for that. And psychological capital, I want to also mention, is one concept that I think fits in sort of a triad of 3 of the most important concepts that are floating around in workplace psychological health right now. And those are psychological capital, again, with the special spelling, psychological safety, and workplace burnout. And psychological safety and workplace burnout are concepts I bet all of you are already familiar with. They are also concepts, though, that are so widely misrepresented that it's just it's troubling. And so psychological safety, for example, I so often find that people, just like when I was talking about the word hope or optimism, I almost wish there was a special scientific word that nobody could pronounce, because psychological safety sounds just like physical safety. And so you walk up to anybody on the street and say, do you know what psychological safety is? They don't think, I better look that up. They think, yeah, I can intuit what that means because I know what physical safety means. And physical safety means protecting yourself from physical injury. So psychological safety means protecting yourself from psychological injury. It's like a hard hat for your emotions, and you've got that, then you don't, experience bad stuff. That's not it at all. That's just not even close to what psychological safety is. Psychological safety is the idea of people being able to express themselves, speak up, participate actively, and take risks in the workplace. It's almost the opposite of protection from emotional harm, because doing all of those things is often uncomfortable. And it means feeling safe, being a little bit unsafe, and being able to say to your boss, yeah, I don't think that's a good idea for these reasons, and feeling like that's going to be okay to do at work. That's what psychological safety is about. Burnout is another one, because burnout, people talk about burnout all the time. I'm getting burned out on watching Game of Thrones or this or that. And we all kind of know what we mean when we say that. We use the word that way. But the World Health Organization has a very specific definition of what workplace burnout is. And it's not this whatever we mean when we say I'm burned out on watching Game of Thrones. It's very specific criteria that have to be met. And if they're not met, then there's not workplace burnout. And all three of the criteria have to be met. And this has gotten to a point where even you will read surveys and you'll see the big headline. The survey says, oh my gosh, 85% of the workforce is burned out. Okay, how do you know that? We asked 1,000 people, do you feel burned out? And 850 said, yeah. All right, that doesn't mean that 85% of the workforce meets the World Health Organization definition of workplace burnout. But again, nobody reads the articles. This is the headline, 85% burned out. Oh my gosh, the sky's falling. I'll scroll to the next thing. And so it's just so important to kind of dig in on these concepts and figure out what these terms really mean. Here's two more QR codes for you. We have, just like the psychological capital, very short article, we've got one on psychological safety and one on workplace burnout. Again, with all the citations that you would need to back up, at a general level, what these concepts are and what they mean. So I tried to reserve a lot of time at the end of this for just open discussion and questions and whatever it is that you may want to talk about. And so at this point, I just want to turn to that, hear from you on anything at all that this may have triggered.
What do you think are the important components of, like making sure you do the upkeep necessary, like on a daily basis to like maintain psychological capital? Because I think like sometimes companies will set objectives and plans, and so like it feels good to hear that plan, but like sometimes there's like low confidence that a company will actually put in the effort on a regular basis to like give you the faith that like they'll see those plans through.
Right. So I think that and this kind of comes back to recall when I put up the slide that had the title of the webinar that was following up on the news article and said, workplace wellness is dead, now what? And have a webinar about it. And in the fine print, one of the things that they talk about is the level of commitment that is required by organizations to actually achieve results. And so you've hit the nail on the head that there are lots of organizations who want to do these things and will claim they're going to do these things. They'll even start down the right path, but then they get distracted and there's other priorities and it just kind of falls off. And that's something that the teams and employees see happening. And that's not a confidence builder at all. One of the things that I believe, and I cannot point you to an article that says this, it's just my opinion from talking to different organizational leaders, is that setting the tone at the top and doing so repeatedly is the critical step number one. So if you are in a large organization and a small unit manager says, we're going to do this. Well, that's one thing. If the CEO says, this is what we're about, and this is how it's going to be, and doesn't say that once, but says that every quarterly meeting, says it over and over again, and is living it and showing it by example, that makes a tremendous difference. The second piece is that a organizational leader, whether it's a CEO or president, whatever the structure is, cannot achieve all that alone. There has to be managers at the middle levels of the organization given training and resources, and they have to buy into the entire concept. And so if you have managers who are receiving, there are training programs for building psychological capital. And if managers are going through that training and doing so repeatedly and going through other kinds of mental health awareness training as part of their work and doing so repeatedly, that makes a big difference. And my hope, at least, is that, you kind of look at the world today. Anybody who works in a large-ish organization, you have an HR department that requires you once a year or once every 6 months to go through anti-harassment training or whatever it may be, and you log in, you do this stuff, you fill out a quiz at the end, and that has not ended workplace harassment by any means, but it's probably helped. It's probably helped quite a bit, and I believe and hope that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, psychological health in the workplace training will be a standard part of what all managers do every 6 months, just like they go through anti-harassment training and so on and so forth. I don't think that's going to magically change the world, but I think it'll probably help to the same extent that harassment training and so forth has. So it's a really long answer to a short question, but I guess the short answer is it's hard and organizations have to be really committed, or else, like your suggestion, employees see right through it.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. It sounds really hard to build psychological capital, both in individual and in the workplace. Can you give some really specific, concrete examples of what this training might include?
Yeah, a lot of the training is thought exercises. And so it looks, honestly, it looks a fair amount like therapy. In the sense that it is thought exercises along the lines of, imagine a circumstance where you had a difficult challenge, and how did you get through that challenge? You write down specifics, and then you identify what are other pathways that could have been followed to get through that challenge, to kind of begin to train your brain on how do you identify pathways to success, how do you recognize that it's very rare that you are really locked in to a situation. And a big piece of the training actually is simply awareness of the concept And so going through what we all just went through of hearing the word psychological capital, hearing that there's 4 components to it, recognizing, and the 4 components aren't rocket science, so you can just hear it once and have a general sense of what it's about. And so having that general awareness is simply part of the training as well. So the training, honestly, it's not it's not difficult in the sense that it requires you to do some task that only some people are able to do. It's tasks that anybody is able to do, but it's difficult in the sense that it takes time and you have to go into it with the mindset of, okay, this isn't just silliness. I'm really going to try, and I'm going to do my best to do these exercises, even if I think it's kind of floofy or whatever.
So you may have mentioned it in your presentation, but I don't remember. Are there any companies that are representing like a good example of building this platform?
I cannot point to one, no. So my answer would be, surely there are. But I can't point to a specific one and say, oh, it's Acme Corporation. They've nailed it.
Sorry, given that you weren't thrilled with how that article was framed and presented, and a lot of times headlines are, they can't represent the whole story, and they're just meant to get people to read.
Yep.
So if CEOs are too lazy to read, that sounds like a liability for them. At least have your assistant read it, But so how would you like to see this issue covered in the media? Like, what do you think would be an effective way for us to be writing about these issues?
Yeah, I think that I certainly recognize the difficulty of the situation, because if you don't have a headline that's going to have people look at the article, then they're not going to look at the article. So, you're right back to where you were if people don't read articles anyway. So, but I think that it's really important to have headlines that do their best to try to present a balanced view. And so I don't know how I would have rewritten that headline. I'm not a headline writer, but, workplace well-being programs have pros and cons, study shows. That's probably not very. Nobody's going to click on that. Yeah. I don't know. It's tough.
I'm curious if the research has shown any difference between small and large teams. One of the studies you mentioned was about, global organizations, obviously probably on the larger side. But I'm curious for a lot of the smaller businesses out there. Intuitively, I would just think a smaller, tight-knit team, it might take less time to build psychological capital. But I'm curious what your research has shown in that regard.
There's a lot more on the related concept of psychological safety in terms of team size than there is on psychological capital. And it's consistent with what you're saying. And so, and it also leads to another one where it makes it, being accurate means you can't make generalizations, which then makes it difficult to say, ABC Global Corporation is a psychologically safe workplace. This is a very difficult thing to say because it's the small teams that really matter. And so, you go to work, you interact with a certain small group of people. You don't interact with the 10,000 people who work all over the globe. And so a company may be psychologically safe in the accounting department in Toledo, but really not at all so much in the Des Moines, Iowa manufacturing facility. And so the researchers often refer to that as the unit of analysis. And the smaller the unit of analysis, the easier it is to study it, the easier it is to measure it, and probably the easier it is to develop it. I don't think the science necessarily says that that's true for sure, but it sure seems to make sense.
Can you remind me of the relationship between psychological capital, psychological safety, and the workplace burnout? I noticed that they were all in this circle, but.
Yep. So psychological safety and burnout have been correlated in the literature. So when psychological safety goes up, burnout tends to go down. And it makes more sense, at least. I'm not sure that we can know with positivity the causal direction, but logically it makes more sense that the change in psychological safety is causing the change in burnout, not that the change in burnout is causing the change in psychological safety. Then there's a lot less on the relationship between psychological capital and the other two. And I say a lot less in terms of many fewer articles, because psychological capital is a less well-developed concept. But there are articles connecting psychological capital to psychological safety. And that's even part of the debate in the literature, which is scholars asking the question, well, when you're talking about psychological capital, are you actually talking about something different than psychological safety? Or are they overlapping in some kind of a Venn diagram? And then teasing that apart through different measurement, statistical measurement methods is a pretty difficult thing to do, but something that people are interested in. I would say that from a practical application point, that we can feel pretty certain that all three are interrelated, and that doing well in one is probably going to help the others. And as for the exact science of how they overlap, I don't think we figured it out yet.
Could you say more about how these sorts of frameworks are developed and how you sort of can take a body of evidence and then create a framework out of that?
Sure. So I'll take, trying to decide whether I'll do psychological capital as an example or psychological safety. On psychological capital, Fred Luthans was the person who first put the concept forward. And Fred, he's a psychologist, but he works in a business school. He's an older gentleman now, and so he's emeritus at this point. But he taught in a business school. He became very interested in positive psychology. So he started looking at the concepts in positive psychology, which include all four of the concepts that are baked into psychological capital. And just, in his head started to think, gee, I wonder if these things pulled together create some kind of a separate concept, because he felt like that's what he was seeing in organizations. And so then the way the work gets done is a lot of it involves questionnaires given to employees and managers and so forth within organizations. And they answer questionnaires about a whole variety of topics, and the questionnaires typically start very long, maybe 100 questions. And then the statisticians do most often what's called factor analysis, which is an approach where you look at how much are all of the questions correlated with one another. And so do you have to ask two questions to know answer A, or would one of those questions get you to answer A and you don't need to ask the extra one? And so that's how you then start to cull down the number of questions. You start to throw some away and say, oh, this one's not really helpful. This one overlaps with that one. Let's choose between one or the other. And then factor analysis also gives you how they are clumping together. And so what the scientists are really interested in, and when they say whether their hypothesis was supported or not supported, if Fred Luthans says, my hypothesis is that there's four concepts and there are these four, and then the factor analysis does in fact show that there's four clumps of questions kind of clustering together, and that a reasonable mind would look at those questions and say, oh, those are kind of all about hope, and these over here are kind of all about resilience, then voila, your hypothesis has been confirmed, and you've got a statistical method that backs up what you thought was going to be happening. And those that's where the debates in the literature can get really tricky, because there are people who devote their entire life to psychometrics and to figuring out the best way to measure this stuff through increasingly complicated statistical methods and increasingly complicated computing methods. And so it can, it's important stuff, but it can also be very dense.
Hi. So you said creating psychological capital requires engagement that looks a lot like therapy. How do you do that and maintain healthy boundaries in the workplace?
Yeah, psychological capital, the specific training there doesn't pry into anyone's personal boundaries in a way that I've ever heard anyone be concerned about. So I'm going to kind of set psychological capital to the side, as that hasn't been a big issue. But on other topics, what you've identified is a really big issue. And it is one of the common objections to the concept that I was talking about earlier of manager training on workplace psychological well-being. Because you bring up that idea to somebody in an HR department, a chief human resources officer, and oftentimes their initial reaction is, well, therapists have special training and our managers don't. And I know our managers, some of them are, they like would be a terrible therapist, and so I don't want them doing this, and I'm worried that it will do more harm than good. And that is a fair point to make. And the response from the researchers who are developing the mental health awareness training among managers is often, well, that's a straw man argument, because we never said this is about making managers therapists. We're saying this is about making managers aware that how people's emotions are affecting them affects their performance at work. And then there may be the rare circumstance where a manager needs to suggest to somebody that they look to the EAP and so forth. And so it also involves training managers that those resources exist and how to get to them. But a big component of the training has to be maintaining appropriate boundaries and teaching managers that because you went through this 3-hour training session does not mean that you should be out there probing into your direct reports' personal lives about things that you have no business probing into. So it's a really important kind of delicate balance and a topic that comes up a lot, and probably is the distinction between a good program and a bad program.
Thank you.
So there seems to be a lot of science on workplace mental health, but I'm really curious about how this is really being implemented, especially in places like physicians where there's a lot of burnout. Are you recommending, or is APA recommending, like retreats where we really focus on psychological health? Are there any overarching recommendations for the ordinary people, like who are really burning out, the cops and the firemen and the physicians? I mean, you just have to think back to the pandemic. So how are we, if we have the science, how is it realistically going to get implemented? Because I just wanted to add, there's been a lot of focus on businesses, and yeah, if you've got a business mentality, you can understand that if you make your employees happy, you're going to make more. But hospitals are not running like that, and other places.
Yeah, one of the sort of tipping points that I think that we're at is when the pandemic started, there was this sort of heightened awareness of the importance of mental health in the workplace. Healthcare workers got a tremendous amount of attention because they were, taking the brunt of it. Had been for a long time before that, but it just, it became a lot more awareness around that time. And a lot of organizations said, we're going to take this seriously, we're going to do something about it. Now the pandemic is over. We're at this tipping point now where organizations, I'm seeing them either falling back to where they were before pre-pandemic, and this just isn't a topic they're going to talk about anymore, or going in the other direction and trying to come up with a forever solution. And I think we're still figuring out what those forever solutions are. And one of the complexities is there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And so this is something that I've struggled with and APA has struggled with, is we would love to be able to put on our website, do this, world of business, and everybody would be better. But it becomes, well, do this for people who are working in the warehouse, or do this for the people in the accounting department. It's so different depending.
Recommendations out there. I mean, like, you've got recommendations from ACOG on something to do for maternal health.
Yep.
Seems like APA should have some, solid recommendation.
We worked with the Surgeon General's office, and in 22 put out the Surgeon General's, it was the first ever mental health, let's see, I'm trying to remember the name. Mental health and well-being in the workplace framework. And it has 5 elements to it. So sort of like 5 buckets. And we refer to those as the 5 essentials. And so those 5 things sort of need to be present in any program. Then within any one of those 5, you can drill down and there are concepts within it. And if you go to, or you just, Google Surgeon General's mental health workplace framework, and it'll pop up, you'll get a neat little diagram, and it provides the framework that you are asking for. Now, where it gets tricky is anybody could look at the framework and criticize it and say, well, that doesn't tell me what to do on Tuesday in my particular office, in my particular workplace. And no, we can't do that. But you could hire a consultant to come in and look at your particular office and what it looks like on a Tuesday and give you some advice for that specific example. The best we can do is what we did with the Surgeon General's office, which is a broad framework where we try to pick up the commonalities, the essentials that need to be present.
You mentioned a few times the CEOs reading the headlines and despairing of workplace wellness programs, and I'm curious whether you spoke to any CEOs who actually saw that headline or similar headlines and are now turned off of the idea of workplace wellness programs.
Zero evidence of that actually happened. Just worry. Just friends emailing each other. Did you read the news this morning? Is this a problem?
I just want to follow up because also as journalists here and this journalist, I can understand your concern, and I don't recall that article, though I think I read it, but I think the vast majority, and correct me if I'm wrong, of workplace mental health are these little apps and these, at least from what I've seen both by reading and also by what friends have said. Yes, I downloaded an app. So while that story may or may not, and I know you just talked about the headline, but people also have very, it's hard to write a good headline, is that it's hard to say what you're talking about is very in-depth and very, I think, pretty rare at this point. And what that is referring to is what most people probably are experiencing when their workplace says we're doing something about mental health. And most people see it as not very effective.
Yeah.
So I think it's not just that maybe the headline or the report is wrong, but it's really focusing on the reality out there about mental health workplace.
Yeah, I think that there are many that the allure of the apps is strong, and the marketplace has become saturated, and it's very difficult to tell a good one from a bad one. There are good ones and there are bad ones. I can't tell you which are the good ones and bad ones. I have a colleague who spends her entire workday trying to figure that out. And it's very alluring for a business who may care deeply about their employees. And it's not coming from a place of, oh, we're going to try to, pull one over on the employees by giving them an app that we know doesn't work. They're trying. They was advertised to them as something that works, and so they think that maybe it will work. It's frustrating for the people who are looking at more organizational level interventions, though, things that are more difficult to do and are more rare, and it's frustrating and disheartening to them to see sometimes businesses that really have no basis in science whatsoever, but have got a cute name and a good advertising model, and are being passed off as helping people. Maybe they're not really.
I think there's a similar thing that happens with trainings themselves, right? That I think a lot of organizations have good intentions and want to invest in them, and then you go through the training, and I think a lot of people in this room have probably had this experience where it's disappointing or it feels like it doesn't quite nail it. And I'm just curious if you have any recommendations or thoughts on how you can kind of suss that out before you go through a training. Because I think the problem when you go through a bad training is that people in the company just are less inclined to want to sit through another one. And I think it can have a really damaging effect. So yeah, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. I have, first off, I share your reaction and concern. And I've done the same thing. I've gone to some of these HR trainings, and you see a video and you almost want to laugh out loud at, how corny it is. And that does not make me want to do more trainings, nor does it make me think that, wow, I'm really getting something important out of this. It makes me think, how can I multitask and still pass the quiz at the end and not have HR calling me? So getting around that is a huge challenge. There is a researcher named Dr. Leslie Hammer who is working on developing mental health awareness training for managers. I've gone through the beta testing on her program, for that purpose. And so that's one approach. I don't know if that's the best approach, but that's what I've seen. That's what I've done. Leslie is aware of that same situation, is reaching out to people like me and saying, will you sit through my training and really tell me honestly, is it too corny, or are people going to get something out of this? So hopefully they'll get better as more people wake up to what you're saying.
Real quick. Oh, go ahead.
So I'm interested, are any businesses and workplaces hiring psychologists in their, in their HR? And you before spoke about consultants and being able to spot a business and what they're doing right or wrong. Like, have these consultants started to become big business, and how do you know if they're well trained or not, and what they're looking at?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the two bubbles that I put on the continuum, sort of the two kinds of psychologists. And there are some companies that are hiring clinical psychologists to be on site and available to employees. There are other companies that are really just trying to accomplish it through access through EAPs. And EAPs, there's plenty to criticize with some EAPs. Some are really good and some are not good at all. Amazon takes a lot of heat in the media for workplace practices, but they do have a clinical psychologist who is their global leader of behavioral health. And his full-time job is thinking about these issues at Amazon and how can he, implement programs to do the best that he can. So it certainly is happening, and all of that has been sort of on this your left side of the continuum, sort of more clinical end. On the more right side of the continuum, then you get into the industrial and organizational psychologists. There's an organization that is a division of the American Psychological Association called SIOP, S-I-O-P, Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology. And they're the leading organization that people who are out in the world as consultants who are PhD psychologists doing this kind of work for businesses typically belong to SIOP. That's where these people are. They have a conference every year. I was just there speaking a couple months ago. They have about 6,000 people who come to their conference. So yeah, it's definitely a business. These people are employed. They're getting paid. They have careers. They're not as prevalent as lots of other industries, but they're growing as well. one of the concerns within that field, within industrial organizational psychology, is how to distinguish somebody who went to a very good industrial organizational program and got a PhD and knows what they're doing from somebody who just hangs out a shingle and says, I'm going to come, make your workplace better. And it's not as if there's a license for that. It's not as if there's a clear set of credentials for that. So it's a marketplace that is in a bit of flux.
Last question. I know we're a little bit over, but I know that a lot of the journalists here are interested in covering, populations that are not just white collar. And I know that you, the APA, have studied, laborers as well as office workers. What should the journalists know about laborers specifically when they're covering mental health?
One of the things that we find with laborers is a striking lack of respect for time off and for work schedules to sort of accommodate their life. And so that seems to be one of the serious problems that is impacting the mental health, not just of the laborers, but there's a spillover effect to their families as well. And it's easy to imagine that if your kid has a soccer game on Saturday and your manager calls you on Saturday morning and says, no, we need you at the construction site, you've got to be here or you lose your job, that affects the entire family, not just that worker. And for whatever reason, that kind of behavior seems to be much more prevalent among those who are doing manual labor than among those who are doing office work.
Dr. Dennis Stolle, thank you so much.
Thank you.